Good morning. Welcome to this episode of All Saints Clubs. I'm Deacon Lisa Siciliano, and I'm assigned at All Saints Parish and in the southern region of the diocese. This morning, I'm going to be making risotto with mushrooms, and oddly enough, while it's an Italian dish, and my father's side of the family is Italian, I don't recall our making risotto at all. It's a recipe I happened on 20 or 30 years ago, and the family loves it. It's wonderful on a cold day, and I am making just the straight recipes worth, which would be enough to feed probably 6 to 8 people, and it can be cut in quarter, half. The only difference would be, don't just cut the liquid for the rice down. I learned to cook from my mother, and my mother's German and Irish. And so what she learned to cook was from the things she learned to cook that were Italian, she learned from her mother-in-law when my parents lived with my grandparents for the first few years after they were married. We're back to those days. Anyway, the basics are, there will be a pan in which you prepare the rice, and another pan in which you prepare the mushrooms to go into the rice. And then I have a third pot here. You use usually chicken or vegetable stock, heated so that you're not putting cold liquid into your rice. Keep that off to the side. The recipe calls for 6 cups of chicken stock is what I'm going to use. And I made some chicken stock, but I only had 2.5 cups. So you see this, better than bouillon? It's a wonderful shortcut. It's a really good brand. I get reduced sodium version of it. But when you don't want to make stock or don't have it on hand, just use the better than bouillon. Follow the directions on the jar. Or you can use the prepared stocks in the cartons. I've done both. So I'm going to let the rest of this stock heat up. And then I usually get the rice going. The mushrooms mixture will go in really towards the end when you add the last of the liquid to the rice. So the rice I use is Arborio. Does everyone know Arborio? It's a little hard to see, but it's a very short-grained rice. I don't know if you can see that. And what I did was just put some regular, this is jasmine, but it's a regular white rice. And if you can see, it's longer and narrower. It also doesn't have nearly the amount of starch that the Italian Arborio has. And with a risotto, the goal is to cook the rice slowly and gently over about half an hour to develop the starch in the rice. So your end product is that nice creamy texture, but the rice is still cooked. All right. I don't have quite 2 cups of rice according to the recipe, so I'm going to just demonstrate what I use. This is just the brand. It's an Italian brand. I don't have a preference. It's what I could get. And I just ordered mine off Amazon because at the time the grocery store did not have it at all. So that was vacuum packed. It'll stay good for quite a while that way. And I'm just going to measure out the rest of my total of 2 cups. I eyeball things. Other than the amount of stock, I seldom do exact measurements unless I'm baking. You notice I have leftover rice. I hate waste, so all I've done is taken an old mixed rice container, cleaned that out, pour in what I have left from the package, and I've labeled it so I don't forget. And I should probably tell you, I'll move in and out of the screen just because I try to keep my work area neat. It makes cleanup easier. So, normally I would have the fan on. I think that's too noisy when we're using the computer speakers. So feel free to use your own fan. It's a very simple, straightforward recipe. I'm going to take 4 cups of butter and heat it in the pan till bubbling hot. I don't do anything special. Unsalted butter. That way I can control salt in the final dish. I'm going to keep this butter out because we'll use it at the very end. All right. I'm also senile at this point in life, so I keep the recipe handy. You really do need a fairly large skillet for the rice portion. It doesn't look like a lot, the 2 cups, but once you start adding the liquid and the rice plumps up, it really is going to need all the pan space. And this is not my favorite skillet in the world. It's just the one that I have large enough to do the rice. And part of the reason it's not my favorite, it really doesn't lay flat on the stove. So I have to make sure, even though with risotto you are supposed to keep stirring, I have to stir more frequently, I found, because the pan tends to dry out right in the middle. Okay. So, I don't know if you can see, the butter is almost beginning to brown a little. So at that point, add the diced onion. If you don't like onion, I found shallot is a really good substitute. It's got a little more delicate of flavor. The recipe calls for half a diced onion. You know, it's how much onion you like. And gonna cook it gently. You don't want to brown the onion. You really just want to get it softened and translucent. Yeah, I think the stock will be about good. Well, while that is softening, I thought I would just cover, had to dice up the mushrooms. I've really already done them. They're in that dish. So I'm just going to take another small one. I know the recipe calls for about half a pound. I love mushrooms, so I'm using more, probably closer to 3/4 of a pound. The original recipe said sliced mushrooms. I'm not a professional chef, so I think the professional chefs would come along and smack my hand for lifting the knife too high and possibly risking getting cut, but I just try to be careful. So you end up with pieces. Ooh, this camera is not that big. I'm going to set this aside and I'll just use it later. All right. I think the onion is about ready. You know, if it ends up a tiny bit brown, that's fine. But mostly it's been softened. So now, check my recipe. I'm just going to pour the rice in. And you want to stir to get, if you can, all the rice grains coated with the hot butter. And you'll want to keep stirring at this point because you're going to toast the rice just a little bit. It won't look brown exactly, but you'll notice after, you know, just a minute or two, the rice grains start to get almost translucent rather than that, you know, solid white. Not quite there. So the other person who taught me about cooking was my high school chemistry teacher. He would show what would happen if you happen to have a gas stove and you just let a little flour fall near the flame, go poof. And so he taught us a lot of the safety around cooking. That's why the bottle of wine is typically, I don't keep it right by the stove. You don't want to pour alcohol accidentally near a hot burner. That's why I always cook in shoes, especially if I'm cooking with something using oil. Taught us a lot of remarkable things, and I wouldn't have thought a chemistry teacher would teach cooking. All right. I'm going to turn the heat down a little bit so the rice doesn't really brown. I don't know if you can see the difference. But the grains are, at this point, starting to get translucent around the edges. So while that finishes, I need a cup of wine, white wine. You know, I think the wine really does end up contributing some flavors that plain water would not and stock alone would not. You can cut the amount of alcohol by using table wine, which usually has a much lower alcohol content. I have always used just white wine. Red wine would probably really overpower this unless you were making it with maybe beef. All right. Now, we're going to add the cup of wine, and you should hear it. Now I'm going to turn the heat up. You really want the rice just to absorb a little bit of the wine and let the alcohol cook off. Yeah, it's starting to bubble. It's boiling just a little bit. And I'm going to keep stirring. All right. I'm not going to let all the liquid cook off. At this point, it's a matter of adding liquid, letting that get absorbed. Some of it will evaporate, but most of it will get absorbed by the rice. And you don't want the pan to completely dry out. You're just going to end up about a cupful at a time. Stop. Well, let me show you. You can see it's mostly been absorbed and alcohol evaporated. So now a cup at a time of the warm stock. My ladle, I happen to know, is 3/4 of a cup. So I add a little bit more than one ladle at a time. And what I have found over the years is that the liquid tends to get absorbed more quickly at the beginning. So I really do have to keep an eye on it. I would not wander off, leave the pan. You can almost see the liquid is actually a little on the thick side once it goes into the rice. So the starches are already beginning to develop. Turn that down. All told, probably once you begin to add the stock, it might be as long as half an hour. There's no need to rush it. Just let it cook. You don't really want to boil. You more want to simmer gently. Believe it or not, I'm almost to the point where I will add the next ladle full of stock. Now that that's going, I'm going to start the mushroom and garlic mix. So a 1/4 cup of olive oil goes into another pan. You could use a slightly larger pan, just depends on how many mushrooms you have. You're not looking to really brown the mushrooms, just really cook them. I eyeball things. I don't worry about whether I'm using extra virgin olive oil or plain olive oil. I I'm just not that fussy to cook. So, take a moment. All right. So now you can see not all the liquid is absorbed, but it's beginning to get drier. So I think at this point I will add another cup of stock. Stir it, make sure nothing's sticking on the bottom of the pan. And then begin heating the mushroom thing. I'll probably put that on about medium. Because I'm using partly that bouillon, even though it's reduced sodium, chances are pretty good I won't need to add salt. But once the rice is getting cooked enough that you would eat it, maybe after the fourth ladle of stock, I would probably taste it and see if it needs any salt. And the way I tell whether my pan with the oil is hot enough is really just the look of the oil. You know, that's still kind of viscous, so I'm going to let it heat a little more. Now, I've already chopped my garlic rather fine. You could use a garlic press, but if you used a garlic press, you're going to want to add the garlic after you've been cooking the mushrooms. The finer the garlic, the more easily it will burn, and you don't want to burn the garlic. Ideally, the point of adding the garlic this early in the mushroom cooking process is you want to flavor the oil with the garlic. And the trick is probably just knowing your stove well enough and all, and keeping an eye on it so that you're cooking the garlic, flavoring the oil, but without burning it. And juggling the rice at the same time. Right. Eyeballing it, I have enough mushrooms in the pan. They will cook down some, but I think when I eyeball how much rice I'm going to have and how much mushroom, that's probably enough. Once again, you can see most of the liquid's been absorbed. And to keep it from sticking, I'll just go ahead and add the next cup of stock. stir just to make sure the liquid is evenly distributed. Normally, I would go around the island and work on the pan from the other side so I don't accidentally hit the ladle, etc. But not today. And the mushrooms just have to be ready in time for that last cup of stock. Once that last cup of stock goes in and is most of the way absorbed, you'll toss in the mushroom mix. So you just get a feel for when to start it for yourself. I tend to be a slow cook, so the prep time takes longer, and I want to make sure the mushrooms are ready to go in. I don't know if you can see this, probably not, but the back of the spoon is actually coated with the rice starch at this point. Next time, we'll get the professional camera added to the top above the stove. And the mushrooms have already started cooking down. And to the mushrooms, I'm going to add a half a cup of the same white wine. Once they're really cooked. You see, it goes pretty quickly. And since it's only David and I anymore, this will last us through, 2 or 3 dinners, a couple of lunches. And since everything we do from home now is via Zoom, everything, all the work and church and everything else sort of bleeds together. So occasionally we'll look up and it's 4:30 to 5 o'clock and we haven't really even thought about dinner. So being able to go to the fridge, pull this out. You can microwave the leftovers, but I find if you happen to have a little chicken stock, vegetable stock, it's usually easier to heat that, a little bit of it, in a pot, maybe this size. This is about a 3/4 pot. Then you can put the leftover risotto in the pot with a little bit of stock heated and warm it gently, almost like you're cooking it again, but not nearly so long. And it heats up pretty well and relatively easily, more uniform than the microwave. I have made this with things like broccoli, either steamed broccoli or roasted in the oven with a squirt of lemon juice. That's delicious. Shrimp, peas, a lot of different options for enhancing the basic cooked rice. If it's something like broccoli or peas, I found it doesn't last as well in the refrigerator. The vegetables tend to taste a bit overcooked. So if I were going to make it with broccoli or peas and shrimp, I would probably cut the recipe in half or even cut it by 2/3. So have it. It tastes great. I enjoy it, but I don't have a lot of leftovers to deal with. Okay. Mushrooms are nearly done. It's absorbing the liquid a little more slowly at this point, the rice is. And so I tend to stir it probably a little more regularly just because I'm trying to continue developing the starch, expose as much of the rice as possible to what liquid is left.
Have you tried making the basic risotto rice recipe and then keeping it in a large quantity and taking out a portion and adding different things like cooked shrimp one time, the other vegetables a different time, and doing the warm up or cooking as you suggested you do anyway?
That is a wonderful, wonderful idea. I've never thought of it. Thank you. Yes, it's a great idea to make the basic rice. Then you have that to add different things to in whatever quantity you might want to have it at that time. I'm going to have to scribble that down later on my cheat sheet. Another way, a lot of times people will do the risotto as sort of a side dish, but one of the ways, I haven't done it in a really long time because we don't eat a whole lot of beef and it's hard to find short ribs, but I would probably do some braised short ribs and serve that over the rice with maybe a side salad. The wine's almost cooked off. So at this point, a little pepper and salt as needed to the mushrooms, because they won't have had anything that added salt to them. And again, I don't use a lot of salt. It really is to taste. And they're cooked enough that you could carefully taste the mushrooms for seasoning. The last thing that will go in the mushrooms is about a teaspoon of freshly chopped parsley. Do not try to use dried. It does not work. I guess you could heat dried up in the stock, so it's going into the rice instead of the mushrooms. If that's what you had, that should work. I still find the fresh parsley gives you the brightest flavor. I don't know if anyone else has this challenge of, even cooking for two. I've heard cooking for one can be challenging. Most things are not packaged in sort of the appropriate quantities. Recipes are frequently, for 6 and 8 people, like this one. But I found even cooking for 2 of us, as I said, maybe in our 30s, this wouldn't have lasted so long in the fridge. We'd have been through it in half a week because we were out gardening and all that sort of thing. But I have found it's much more challenging now. We don't do as much. And even if we did as much, we probably can't use the same number of calories. All right, I am going to turn the mushrooms off, the heat off, sprinkle my little bit of parsley in. Stir it, and then just leave the pan on the turned off burner. The mushrooms are cooked. I think they still have some texture to them. They're not mushy. David and Faye never liked white button mushrooms very much. So I haven't used them in a long while. But if you prefer the white button mushrooms, you can use shiitake, oyster, whatever you have handy. You'll probably get a slightly different texture than you do with the Portobello mushrooms. They tend to stay firmer. You see how much more plumped the rice is. Time for another ladle. Plumped enough it splooshed when I stirred the pan. Trusty fork. I think this has cooked enough. It won't taste done, but I'll be able to tell if it needs any salt or pepper. And the pepper I would probably put in at the end. The mushrooms have black pepper. I might put some white pepper in the risotto. Maybe a little salt. I cook with kosher salt, but it really doesn't matter. Whatever you cook with. See, easy. Once you get the basics down, you can do it almost in your sleep if you can remember to stand up and stir in your sleep, or sit on a stool and stir. You may have to reduce the temperature after a while.
Lisa, this is Deb.
Yes, Deb.
I just wanted to say my daughter has made a risotto with butternut squash that she says is delicious. So that's another option for you.
I'm glad you said that, because occasionally I will do that, butternut squash. Do you know, does she roast her squash first? Or?
She does, yeah.
Yeah, that really seems to bring out the flavor.
Yeah, she really enjoys doing that.
Has she made it for you yet?
No. You know, at least not over the last year anyway.
I think the other positive about having leftovers in the refrigerator, and enough of them, it means I don't have to go to the grocery store as often. So that's been much appreciated this last year. Now, normally I would make this and then we would have it today, but the menu for the week, because we do not just a grocery list, but a menu for the week, that has something else on it for tonight. So.
Lisa, what are you looking for in the risotto itself to decide that it's done already?
A mouthfeel and a degree of creaminess and plumpness to the rice. It's almost guaranteed to be done after the last stock. But I will, hold on, let me get a different one. The mouthfeel, it's toothsome, almost like pasta being al dente, but not raw tasting or a raw feel to the rice, just a firmness. It's nearly done, but we'll definitely need that last bit of stock. So you see, it doesn't particularly look a lot different, well, compared to the last addition of stock. It definitely looks different than when one begins. I don't know, some people swear by being able to throw that bit of spaghetti against the wall, and I probably would have been banished from the kitchen if I had ever done that. So I just go by feel, and I was raised on pasta dishes. So I have a sense both for done and what I like. I would say probably the rice ends up a little softer over the course of reheating, not by much. All right. I have a little bit of stock left in this pot. I'm just going to put it in. And just use it probably a little bit more than a total of 6 cups, but that won't hurt this. Now I'm going to presume it'll be cooked. we will have a few things to finish it. Butter back over. And you'll adjust the seasonings for your taste right before you plate it up. Yeah, I can feel things trying to stick right in the middle of the pan. So just keep stirring, and you have to scrape a little bit. Go ahead. Almost. I'm going to add a little white pepper. I love peppers. I finally found a recipe that had enough black pepper in it for me. It's called Tuscan beef, and it uses tablespoons of freshly crushed black pepper. So adding a little white pepper is not in the recipe, but I like it. And at this point, with the last of the stock added in, we're looking for maybe sort of porridgey, oatmeal-y texture. And then the mushrooms can go in. Stir to combine. And now it's just a matter of letting the last of that stock get absorbed, not till it's dry, just creamy, and you don't want liquid pooling in there anywhere. And it's started to boil, so I've turned the heat down a bit on my stove. Simmering is okay. But again, you're trying to give the rice as much time as it needs to absorb liquid. And let's see, I'm curious. The rice is plump enough where I would say it's not splitting the way you might see splitting with a wild rice once it's really cooked. This still has its integrity as grains of rice. But it's much clearer.
Lisa?
Yes?
When you put the mushrooms in, were they completely dry?
It's a little hard to tell because I cooked them in olive oil. So they would have had their liquid and all the wine cooked off.
Right.
But it will still look like there's oil.
Okay, thanks.
Getting there, almost done. It's not easy to see, but the reason it's not quite done is there's some liquid whoop, at the bottom of the cooling when I pull the rice off to the side, and I need to get that absorbed. All right, I'm gonna get ready to finish. So once the liquid's really mostly absorbed and it just looks kind of silky and smooth, you're going to take 2 tablespoons of butter. You can use less if you like, but I find it really does make a difference in the end, both to the flavor and the texture of the whole thing being feeling really emulsified. So you'll add 2 tablespoons of butter and melt that. Grate in maybe as much as a half cup of parmesan. You know, no, I don't order my parmesan online from the Italian shop. I go to the Giant and pick out whatever's there that looks decent or that I've used before. I always grate mine fresh. I tend not to use the pre-grated stuff, but you know, whatever works for you. All right, this is really close because there's not really a lot of liquid pooling, but everything is soft and pretty creamy. So I am going to declare that done. I'm going to turn the heat almost off. Melt the butter. Butter never hurt anything, right? Grate my cheese. I obviously take this close. I use a microplane. I found it safer on my hands than the box graters. The other thing you could do is leave the cheese out if you weren't going to eat this right away. Cheese tends to lose its flavor once grated and in a dish for any length of time. You could always, when you reheat it in stock or water, you could always add your cheese once that's reheated so it's as fresh as possible. Put that later. Smells good. Maybe this is lunch today. Help fortify me for the grocery store. All right, just stir until it's nicely incorporated. sure the heat's on. Okay, I'm just trying to get some of the weight out of the pan so I can hold it up. I have a little bit more chopped fresh parsley here. And you could always, if you're serving company, you can always take a little sprig of parsley.
Lisa, it looks wonderful. I can smell it. Oh, Italy come rushing back.
You know, it was interesting. Even though I had some Italian family, I was the youngest of all the cousins. So I didn't learn. I wasn't really allowed in the kitchen, you know, when the older cousins were there. So there are things I have not learned to make. And I thought some things my grandmother did when I could watch looked very odd. You know, using stale bread that they kept wrapped in a tea towel, until I went to Italy to work for a month. And I met my grandmother's much younger sisters who were still old at that point. And what did they do in the kitchen? The same things my grandmother did, same kinds of food, not risotto for some reason. But I have very happy memories of finally connecting my grandmother to the rest of her family and how they cook. So that's really all there is to it.
That was great.
Thank you, Lisa, so much. It's wonderful and looks
beautiful.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.